Hello, my name is Tej van Pettinger from Economics Help, and today we're going to look at the causes of globalization and whether indeed globalization is starting to slow down. So first of all, globalization refers to the greater integration and interdependence of a world economy. It involves things such as a greater trade amongst nations and also the greater movement of both workers, capital, but also ideas and technology. So a few hundred years ago, nations were very much isolated. There was a little bit of trade, but there's huge differences in their economy. But now, with globalization, economies are much more closely linked. And what caused this big rise in exports as a share of global GDP? Well, some of them were relatively mundane, but still had a very big effect. The first thing is that the cost of transporting goods fell very significantly. One factor was the introduction of containers, shipping containers, and there was a standardization accepted around the world. And it meant that it was much cheaper to load goods onto boats and also to take the containers to other modes of transport like trains or lorries at the other end. So it's much more efficient, and this helped to really push that cost lower down and made trade a lot more affordable. And then you also have a greater movement towards free trade. Since the Second World War, there's been a movement towards cutting tariff barriers, increasing free trade, and many countries started to open themselves up. Take the example of China. In the 60s, it was basically very insular because of the communist regime. But in the 80s, when it opened up and started to allow trade, the economy really took off. Also, if you look from an economic theoretical point of view, ideas such as comparative advantage show that there's a driving force behind trade because firms can shift production to where labour costs are lower. So in the 50s and 60s, the UK and the US were quite strong manufacturing bases. But as labour costs rose relative to elsewhere, it became cheaper for multinationals to offshore a lot of production. So you see a lot of manufacturing shifting to China. And unless it's very high skilled production, the West, European Union and America can't compete with the much lower labour costs in Asia. And also another factor is economies of scale. That some economists who look at new trade theory state that it's not so much about producing where you have a comparative advantage, but simply specializing in producing one good or service enables very significant economies of scale. So if you take an industry like the car industry, the economies of scale are really very high. I mean, we're talking of hundreds of thousands of cars or even millions of cars to get the lowest average costs. And so this means that car firms have really specialized in a global context. So it's very rare that a car would be made in one country alone. What tends to happen is that the engines may be made in Germany, the tires and rubber comes from, say, Indonesia, and then all these raw materials from around the world may be brought to, say, a factory in Sunderland in the UK, where it's assembled. But the process of making a car is very global because there's specialization. And I'm taking this with an Apple iPhone, and the design, the marketing is based in America, but the production is in China because that's where labor costs are lower. So what else might have caused globalization? Well, you have a rise in trading blocs like the European Union and NAFTA, which help to reduce barriers to trade and encourage a greater sense of integration. You also have the growth of multinational companies. So something like Coca-Cola and Pepsi and Apple have become very ubiquitous around the world. And there's a strong demand for these global brands, and that's why they spend billions advertising at the Olympics. You also have a growth in global finance, not always outwardly visible, but the financial crisis of 2008 kind of showed how interlinked everything is, with banks borrowing and lending around the world. So when there was a crisis in the Florida mortgage market, it affected banks around the world because they all had a stake to some extent in the American economy. Also, there's been a growth in foreign direct investment, with Western multinationals wanting to move production to where labour costs are lower, and China has increasingly invested in Africa as it seeks to gain more access to raw materials and to commodities. So these are some of the factors behind the growth of globalisation. There are more, but you can look at the post that I wrote on this for that. But another interesting factor is that since 2008, the growth of globalisation has started to slow down, and some even feel it may be going into reverse. So why, after all these years of very rapid growth, might globalisation be slowing down? Well, in a nutshell, some people believe we've kind of reached the peak of reducing transport costs because the effects of containerization are fully exploited, and there's not the same kind of growth possible. Secondly, the economies are shifting more towards services rather than goods, and it's much harder to export a service like a hairdresser or being a teacher. And so as the incomes grow, we're spending that money on going to a restaurant, not buying more electronics from China. Secondly, the consumer is becoming more discerning. When you go to buy goods these days, we're looking for greater customization. And so firms, where possible, are trying to make production more adaptable to consumer preferences. And so that might involve keeping it close to where consumers are. For example, it takes quite a few months to send a product from China to America on a ship. And by that time, consumer preferences may have changed. But if you can do 3D printing in the United States, then you can get the good to the consumer much more quickly. And another factor behind the slowdown in globalization is that labour costs used to be incredibly important. If you have a labour-intensive industry like clothing, it makes sense to shift production to Bangladesh, India, China, where labour costs are low. But the growth of new technology like AI and 3D printing and automation means that the labour costs maybe start to become less important. And so if labour costs are less important, there's less need to shift manufacturing to low labour cost countries. So there's a trend, not too big, but it is starting, of what they call reshoring, bringing production back to the developed world where it's closer to the consumer base. Another factor is that there's much greater awareness of the environmental costs of globalization. For example, the costs of transport leading to CO2 emissions. And some consumers are becoming more discerning and wanting to buy local. They don't want to always buy multinational imports. And where possible, some people want to buy local produce rather than importing avocados from, all the way around the world. Also, the internet and COVID have shown that you don't necessarily need to travel all the way around the world. Rather than getting on a plane, people are perhaps staying at home and doing a conference via Zoom rather than actually traveling. So these are some of the factors that are causing a slowdown in globalisation. And it's not to say that globalisation is going to go away, because in some respects globalisation is increasing in the sense of media and social media platform. Very much a global feature, and you can't separate it by country. So in one sense we're getting a sense of like one world, but in practical terms the amount of trade of goods and services that we import and export, there's a limited growth for it, and it may well be that we've kind of reached peak globalization with around 30% of global exports percentage of GDP.